there. He's been, he has a kind of extensive background from the research side. He's published a few papers on silvopasture. So I want to go on and turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, JB. So my charge really today is to set the stage for all the better presenters that are going to follow me. And I want to try to do that by describing silvopasture and some of its benefits and thinking a little bit in terms of what we know from the research perspective. After I'm done with that, Sid Brantley will lay out some of the terms and the opportunities for Virginia and how ways to work with clientele. So I asked the question, what is silvopasture? I present this picture is taken from Missouri. There's a thinning and sort of a post oak stand for this part of the world. So we do have hardwood stands, and perhaps we can get to something like this. Yesterday we were on a site where there were some challenges, some attempt at silvopasture, but I don't think we were quite there yet. So we have a lot of questions about how to make something like this work and keep it functioning over a long period of time. And I'll speak to that time issue in just a minute. This picture may be something that's more relevant for the Southside Virginia. This picture probably comes out of Florida, I think is where I got this one. And you can see I've got, I don't know if it was slash or loblolly longleaf, some sort of pine here with warm season grasses and the livestock underneath it. So I asked the question, what is silvopasture? And before I do that further, I'd like to just kind of put it in context. And we're thinking about integrating trees into production systems, and silvopasture is, from one way to define it, it's one of 5 classic agroforestry practices, and those would include riparian buffer strips, which many of you are probably familiar with in terms of trying to implement some sort of erosion and protection plan with a riparian buffer strip. There are other agroforestry practices, including forest farming, where I've thinned and managed that tree in a sort of that stand in a semi-wild way, but I'm getting crops like ginseng or mushrooms or golden seal, some high-value crop typically that's a shade-loving crop. Windbreaks, we used to see those. We don't see as many of those anymore since corn has gone way up and people have taken their windrows out or windbreaks out. But quite frankly, there's quite a bit of data out there that shows that yields are actually better with windbreaks in the system. And alley cropping is probably the thing that we see the least of in this country. This picture is actually taken in France. They're harvesting wheat under poplar trees. These systems are also used in China. We could use them here, but I think that's probably, while some consider it low-hanging fruit relative to environmental conservation, from a cultural change, this would really probably be one of the hardest. And one of the easiest, I think, though, will be silvopastures, because I think there are some issues that we confront from a forage livestock production standpoint where trees can actually be used to our benefit. So, I want to define something. Oftentimes, I can define something better by saying what it's not, right? You say, well, what is that? Well, it's not X, Y, or Z. It's, okay, so silvopasture is not new. And I think many of you probably have seen some form of silvopasture in your life. You may not have recognized it as that. It may not have really truly fit the definition in that the trees were not particularly well managed, but these systems are not new. They're still commonly used in parts of the developing world, and this picture is not a developing world shot. This was taken in Blacksburg just a couple years ago. What you've got is essentially a tall fescue, bluegrass, white clover forage base under black locust trees. And I'd say probably 3-4 generations ago, this would have been common in Appalachia. You would have grown these locust trees. They're putting nitrogen back into the system. Their young sprouts are a form of browse. The trees become timbers for utility buildings. They become firewood. They become fence posts. Very common from that perspective. Silvopasture also is not turning cows loose in the forest. And I think if there's any sort of image that foresters have and conservationists have about this idea or a misconception about silvopasture, this is probably one of the biggest ones for the conservation community. I don't want those cows in that tree, in that woods. That's going to tear that stuff up. Well, do you see any sort of management here? There's no management in this picture. We've just turned them loose in the back 40. and there's too much of that goes on. In the same way, I think agriculturalists have real headaches or hang-ups with silvopasture because they say, I don't want trees in my system. But a silvopasture is not a single tree standing guard over the pasture, over a quagmire that's just a vector for parasites and E. coli and other disease organisms. And I think it's this kind of image, or perhaps these kind of images, where I've got not only autumn olive and multiflora rose and other kinds of stuff that's coming up here, or I've got cedars that are taken over here. I think it's these kind of images that convey the negative message to the agricultural community. That's what their vision of silvopasture is. And this, neither of these would be accurately described as silvopasture. So, how do we define it? Couple of big names in the silvopasture community, Terry Clausen and Stephen Sharrow, they defined silvopasture as a land management practice that intensively integrates integrates intensive animal production, silviculture, management of the trees, and forage management, all together on the same land base. And functionally, what's happening is we're working to have a system that gives us both short and long-term returns. So, sustainable practice, intensive integrated management with trees, forages, and livestock. So I've got to be managing all these components, not just one or two. And again, two different economic scales or time frames. And I have laid this as silvopasture represents an opportunity. And I wanted to describe some of those opportunities and explore how this works in some of the next few slides. There is quite a bit of evidence. There's quite a bit of evidence in the literature about why we might want to do silvopasture in terms of increased forage production, improved forage nutritive value, greater animal performance. What else we got here? Production of additional products, added biodiversity, soil fertility and increases and reduced erosion, and improved stream quality. Now, you may not get all of these production functions with the silvopasture, and we'll talk about that. But there are, again, these added conservation benefits, and so I wanted to try to describe some of these things. And one of the first questions I would say was, or you might be having, is, okay, this will cure everything except ingrown toenails. Fantastic. How do you make this work? Well, what we need to think about is what are the resources in the system, and what are the tree-forage interactions in these systems? Because typically we often think of trees and forages as being competitive, and they may well be, but can we manage those relationships so that the whole perhaps is greater than the sum of its parts? And when we look at resources in the system, the first one, we've got light, there's soil nutrients, moisture, the nutrient returns from the trees and the forages and the livestock. How do we manage each of those components so that this thing will work? Looking first at light, the energy coming into the system to drive the whole system, I want to make sort of essentially 4 points on this slide. First, if you remember your biology class, you learned the C3 photosynthetic pathway, just that 3 carbon compounds that are being made when carbon dioxide is converted into plant tissue. Those C3 plants are light saturated at about 50% full sun. Now, what does that mean?
It means all they need is 50% to maintain all production.
Well, that means that exactly. They're not going to do anything more if they get more sunlight, right? So above 50%, that's a loss. Now, I will say in a dense stand, you probably need more than 50% sunlight because the individual leaf is light saturated at 50%, but you've got to have a little more light to get down into the canopy. So oftentimes when we talk about silvopastures, you hear people say, well, kind of about 50% shade, probably a little bit less than that. But those are some of the questions we're working on. Still, at the end of the day, the point for bullet 1 is that these leaves are light saturated. So that represents an opportunity to capture more of that sunlight resource in other products if we can manage it appropriately. Another thing that happens when plants are shaded, C3 plants, when they're shaded, especially, well, not especially, but all plants will have greater leaf growth at the expense of roots. So sometimes what happens is that plant, when it's shaded, it partitions more to above ground growth, and we actually can see increases in productivity. Third point, diffuse light is used more efficiently than direct beam. So if I've got a tree in the system and the light hits it and it bounces off of it, or it hits the ground, bounces up underneath the canopy, it's moving around, so it can hit the forage canopy from many different angles. And that allows for greater light penetration, and that can improve the use efficiency of that light. Fourth point, light quality and quantity are going to differ by tree species. And you see my cartoons, I've got sort of a pine tree here versus something like an oak or a maple that might have a very heavy, dense canopy, or something like, say, a walnut or a pecan or an ash tree that might have more open canopy. And many times these trees with the open canopy, often they will also have compound leaves, and those compound leaves with the smaller leaflets allow more light through the canopy as well. What does this, for you forage people out there, you can see the green line represents the cool season grass. What does the yellow line look like? Looks like what we would typically impose as the warm season grass growth curve, right? And we often talk about trying to integrate warm season grasses with cool season grasses in a forage system so that we have more productivity over the course of the year, and we can kind of help offset the summer slump. Well, in some cases, we can use the temporal partitioning in terms of trees to fit these systems as well. So if my tree is leafing out in late April or early May, it's coming after the kind of that peak of performance for that cool season grass growth curve. So we can take advantage at times, depending on what we're trying to do, but we have an opportunity to select trees to take advantage of these differences in phenology or temporal partitioning.
What would be an example of the warm season tree?
A black walnut, black locust come on later, pecans come on later. I'm not sure to what degree hickories come on later, but pecans are in the hickory family. There's some others that are not popping to my mind right off the top of my head, but those nut trees are a good example, and from an agroforestry or silvopasture perspective, they also offer opportunity for additional products and nuts and that sort of thing. So just an idea there. So light also affects temperature, and that's probably a very critical aspect in many respects. This slide shows some data that we took in 2003. We had little soil temperature monitors stuck at like the soil surface level, and the bottom blue line here is ambient air temperature, and then we had 3 densities of trees, kind of high, medium, and low density. So you see the soil temperature at low density, which is essentially an open site. That's about 10 degrees higher than ambient air temperature. And then on the x-axis, what we've got are months, and what we're looking at then is the average daily fluctuation in soil surface temperature. So if I'm in May, I've got by about 6 a.m. I'm down here in the 50s in terms of soil surface temperature, and ambient temperature is maybe almost down to 50, and by noon I'm up over 80 in these open sites. So I've got large fluctuations. So by having, and these trees really don't start leafing out till about mid-May. So by having these trees in the system, this is an average of black walnut and honey locust trees. If I look at that averaged over the month, these tree systems where I've got sort of moderate and higher density are sparing me in terms of temperature probably 6, 8, 10 degrees sometimes. And if you look across the growing season, that system is buffered by having a bit of shade there. Now, there's a pink line here that I want to show you. What's the significance of this pink line? If you look back at some of the early studies of forage production and their relationship to temperature, a cool season grass growth performance is probably at the optimum temperature for that in the mid-70s. And so you can see how temperature for these systems, I'm getting hotter, certainly at soil surface temperature in these big open sites and even in the moderate tree density sites, but that density, or those trees, are helping to buffer that system, keep those forages cooler, and they will allow for some greater or lower stress environments, I should say, for the forages in the systems with some shade. So temperature also affects digestibility, and this is some work that was done in Louisiana. These are actually growth chamber studies, I think. They did see a positive relationship, as you would expect, with a warm season grass in terms of yield in relationship to light and temperature. But notice the issue or the impact on digestibility. As day-night temperatures were increased, digestibility declined. So if I reduce that temperature, as those temperatures come down, the digestibility of that material is going up. Moisture is often a question that's asked about. Well, you know, those trees and those grasses are going to compete with each other for moisture. And that, you know, that may very well be true. That can be site specific. It's also tree species specific. But what we know from some of our work with deciduous silvopastures anyway is that many times there are no soil moisture differences between, say, open sites and sites with trees. The tree shade can reduce the evapotranspiration that's going on because, again, the forage canopy is less stressed, so it's pulling less water out of the system. The temperatures are cooler, and you're keeping more moisture there in the system. So I make the caveat. Again, those responses are going to vary across the range of soil and site and conditions and tree species. Now, I want to introduce a concept called competitive partitioning. And this is where two crops are competing for the same resources. And because I've got that kind of competition going on, I create a more efficient use or exploitation of the resources than is possible with a single species. And if you go to the National Agroforestry Center, you'll find a slide or kind of picture that looks sort of like this. And this would explain some of that competitive partitioning. I've got competition for resources, but it happens at different phases in time. We already talked about that a little bit. So this would be temporal partitioning. So, you know, if the tree is leafing out later, it's got a demand for the resources at a time when maybe that cool season grass has less demand or is under some stress, and so it's shut down some. I may also have exclusive access where, you know, tree roots and grass roots are not in the same region. Or I can have separate sources altogether. I mean, it may be that the trees and they're getting down deeper into the soil profile, and so they've got opportunity to access water and to access nutrients that the grasses just can't even do because they can't put roots down there. So these differences in space and in time can allow for positive or beneficial relationships there in terms of that competitive partitioning. So, okay, I've spoken about all of these different inputs. What about system outputs? You know, what are the implications there? This picture, by the way, is one where we had, these are probably 8 or 9 year old black walnut trees, I think, and this was looking at different densities of tree and then slope position. We also had some species comparisons too. But you can see that kind of mottled effect that you get with this somewhat open canopy structure of these black walnut trees. So this study, there have been a few studies, and then there's a pretty big gap in the literature. From the 39 and 42, research in Tennessee and Ohio showed that they had increased carrying capacity for livestock with black walnut or honey locust trees in the system. The Ohio research, they had better yield and better forages when they had black walnut or black locusts in the system. Then in 2005, we published these data that were with black walnut and honey locust trees, and this is the average forage productivity from these two different tree species across these different slope positions. And I'll just make one comment about the weather. Do any of you remember what the weather was like in 2002? It was extremely dry. We were under a water use restriction here in the state. And in 2003, do you remember what it was like? In Blacksburg, it's almost like the good Lord never turned the tap off. I mean, it was just wet and cloudy all summer. And so we have very different environmental conditions for those two seasons, and yet the response for those 2 years is the same in that when I have a moderate level of tree density or a moderate level of shade, I was getting about a 15-16% increase in forage productivity. Now, I don't say that that's going to happen every time. Again, these are young trees. There's a lot of factors that are involved there. But all I want to make the point is that we can use these trees if we, with appropriate management, the right site conditions, we can actually see increases in forage productivity. What about nutritive value? Some of these studies that are reported are simply shade studies. They're not necessarily tree studies. The general consensus when you look at the research is that mineral concentrations are typically higher in shaded plants. Crude protein is often greater, not always, but it's often greater. Many times we have reduced fiber concentrations, neutral detergent fiber. Sometimes that is not changed. Rather routinely, lower light environments, we have reduced non-structural carbohydrate. And so what's the implication there? You know, that'd be kind of like offering you cinnamon rolls with no icing. You know, I'm going to lose some of that sugar. And so it may be that the animals, just from a pure taste preference standpoint, they may not like it quite as much. I've had people tell me, well, my cows don't graze this stuff under the trees. I don't know if that's reduced sugar or if that's just because their cows laid on it and did all their business on it for, you know, a week ago and they're not interested in eating it now. But at any rate, you can see reduced non-structural carbohydrates rather routinely in a shaded plant. Okay, there may be a trade-off. The plant's less stressed. I've already spoken to the opportunities for it to be less stressed. I already showed you the increase in digestibility that occurred at the lower temperatures. And so if fiber digestibility is increased, that offsets to some degree the reduction in non-structural carbohydrates that you see in these shaded plants. So we have some livestock production data from Virginia. I'm not going to try to get into that right now. I would like to show you some older literature and, well, a little bit of both. Incidentally, this picture is taken at Kentland. These are cattle under black walnut trees. This stand has been thinned further. They're now on about a 40 by 40 grid, which leaves us with about 25 stems per acre, I think is what we're looking at. If you go back and look at the literature, so you go back to Arkansas back in the 50s, and they did a study looking at cow-calf performance in systems where they had boxes that provided shade versus trees that provided shade. This is not necessarily a silvopasture arrangement, and they were looking at animal performance. And what you see is that there's, you know, over a pound per day difference from those cows that had no shade versus those cows that had access to artificial shade. The calf seems to be buffered a little bit more. Perhaps they're sucking on mama, so that doesn't mean as much relative to the nutrition. Maybe they're standing in mama's shade. They're still gaining more, you know, 0.7 of a pound per day. They're still gaining more than those calves that had access to no shade. Now, I got into a discussion with some colleagues recently, and we were talking about these systems, and you know, there's a question about reduced forage productivity because, again, I said all of these things are sort of site specific. But if you look at more recent work from Missouri, and just to frame this for you, what they did in this study was they set these pitch lob pines in outer rows, and those trees are trainer trees. And then they put a row of black walnuts here because they're looking at black walnut as a long-term timber crop. They're not necessarily worried about nuts, which could be harvested. But you've got a ladder here. They're trimming up the bole of this black walnut tree, and they're trying to create a high-value tree. And the trainers will grow up, force that tree up straight, and then they'll come back, you know, at the 15, 20-year mark, take the pitch lobs out, and they've got these nice stands of black walnut trees. In the meantime, what they've done then is they're planting annual ryegrass, and this is a spring grazing study where they had planted annual ryegrass in between these rows of trees. Now this is a, you know, pretty intensive, a lot of trees in the system, and they ended up reducing seasonal forage yield by 20%. But their measures of nutritional value of the forage was, you know, greater, and they saw no difference in animal performance. So now they've got tree crops, and they've not lost animal performance, even though forage productivity has gone down a little bit. So this gets me to this idea, I want to get to an idea called land equivalency ratio, and we'll say, even if all the relationships are negative competitive, I've got some competition for resources that's reducing productivity somewhere else, silvopastures still have the potential, with correct management, to be more productive than open pastures. And so how is that true? How can that be? So we're talking about this land equivalency ratio. If I have a forage system, and that forage system in monoculture, it can only produce as much as it can produce. That's land equivalency ratio of 100 or 1, depending on how you want to call it. Same way with the livestock. If I have a forested system, I got 100% land equivalency ratio. And so if I take the two and I merge them, I may see that 20% reduction in forages. I may even see a 10% reduction in cattle performance. Now, I'm just trying to think about this as negatively as possible. But by nature of the fact that I've added trees to the system, I can get increases in total output from that land. What about conservation functions? I mean, I've spent all this time talking about productivity, but many of you are here as agents of change for conservation, and I want to address some of the conservation functions. So I found this the other day on the net. I'm not sure if this report's actually been released yet. I think it was kind of a tentative deal, but they were assessing areas in 2012, looking at impaired waters in Virginia. And so to lay the table, you've got rivers, lakes, or estuaries that, and they're measures in miles, acres, or square miles of these water bodies, and they're assessing different numbers of them. Nothing less than 35% in terms of the rivers were assessed, and up to almost 100% of the lakes and 85% of the estuaries were assessed. And then of those that they assessed, of those that were assessed, 71%, nothing less than 71%, impaired. So what are you going to do about that? A lot of our work has been getting people to fence water bodies. And I think that's a great thing to do. Now, don't get me wrong, but my question for you is fencing the complete solution to this problem? Is fencing going to take care of all of our problems? And you say, well, yeah, it's cleaning up the water. Yeah, but fencing is not solving tall fescue toxicosis. So for all of you who are not related to forage livestock, let me put that in context for you. Tall fescue is the primary forage base for Virginia, and quite frankly, most of the land east of the Mississippi. Once you get, from, say, the Carolinas and on up into Maryland, maybe even to Pennsylvania parts, but we use a tremendous amount of tall fescue in this country. And most of that tall fescue is infected with a fungus. This picture shows this little blue stain is the fungus growing sort of between the plant cells. Most of that fescue is infected with a fungus, and that fungus causes quite a number of issues for livestock. This picture was taken in Blacksburg. It was a mild, probably 80, 85 degree day. What you see in the background is tall fescue that has the fungus that's non-toxic. And in the foreground, they're grazing tall fescue that has the toxic fungus. And what these cattle have done, you can see how woolly they are. And what they've done, they have only access to water in these tubs, and they've created their own waller to cool down. These cattle are trying to go to water to cool down. So you say, well, hey, you got the non-toxic tall fescue, just go ahead and replace it all. Well, that's great. It's not always an option. And I look at this and I say, well, this is a great opportunity to incorporate trees, to provide relief to these cattle, to reduce erosion, to increase water infiltration. There's a whole host of conservation benefits that could be gained from these systems without worrying about the productivity functions. So I think you can make an argument for silvopastures even on that, from that standpoint. Number of considerations. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay. I'm not going to have time to get through all the rest of these issues. Right? There are a number of management considerations. What are the existing resources? Are you going to thin? Are you going to plant? What are the livestock? The markets? Blah, blah, blah. And hopefully Sid will cover a number of those. In your handouts, I've given you this kind of slide broken out in a couple of pieces. My question is, maybe I've got some degraded land. Can I turn that into an opportunity as opposed to just looking at that as a challenge? Maybe I can create some silvopasture there. Or in this case, in the bottom slide, where I've got land that's, the cattle have been in it, it's full of invasive species, it's not well managed. Can I turn that into something that's productive and functional and better for the trees, better for the environment? On the flip side, if I'm planting, I have opportunities in terms of I can choose what species. I don't have to necessarily take the junk wood that's left in that degraded wood site, but they're going to take time to reach size, and I've got to deal with protection, a number of issues like that. Whole host of criteria to deal with in terms of thinning trees. And what do we do about the forages underneath them? Well, a lot of the evidence would suggest that our usual suspects in terms of forages that are adapted to the region will work well in those systems. Tall fescue, orchard grass. Legumes are a little less shade tolerant, so that may be an issue. And that's one of the things you see with some of the black walnut. The juglone is an issue in terms of allelopathy relative to clover. So there are some issues there in terms of finding appropriate forage tree combinations that will work. Planting trees also have a number of sort of selection criteria that have to be addressed in terms of, is this a tree that's going to give me some sort of marketable product? Do I want that only for wood? Can I get additional products out of it? How do I do that? What are my rotation lengths, etc.? Another kind of visual example of how we can spatially configure pine trees in this example to meet our needs, where you've got large alleys that are allowing for the movement of cattle and equipment. From the standpoint of planting trees, there are a number of questions about what are the opportunities. Chris, of warm season trees, black locust, honey locusts, walnut, pecan, hickory. There's even some discussion of the possibility of using American chestnut, which wouldn't probably happen in this region, but using silvopastures as a way to reintroduce the American chestnut back into our forested systems. You may ask questions of, well, why oak, maple? Those are high shade trees. Well, it kind of depends on the objective of the landowner and what the opportunity is, and how you manage those trees may be a little bit different if you're thinking still in terms of having a high degree of forage productivity in the system. It's important that we match the trees to the conditions of the site and to the needs of the landowner. Again, if we can think about ways to have additional products to come off of there, pine straw has become a big market in the southeast or further south of here. May or may not be achievable for us. A lot of this is done with longleaf pine, which rakes up very nicely and can be baled up more easily than something like loblolly. But loblolly is probably going to be our best shot at it if we can do something with pine straw in this state. I show a picture of the honey locust. This tree is it's already dropped its leaves and it's full of pods. Some of our early evidence suggests that that's worth about $150 an acre in terms of the value, the nutritional value of those pods. We've compared that with corn. It comes out very favorably with whole ear corn. Other issues, again, in terms of livestock and tree compatibility, and we can talk about that later perhaps, and some of the protection methods that are needed. Gene Garrett was one of the kind of the founding fathers of some of the silvopasture agroforestry ideas. His line, this quote from him, "Silvopasture management requires shifting our thinking in both spatial and temporal domains and demands skills in managing complexity rather than reducing complexity." So, and I leave you with this as just kind of a shout out to all my NRCS friends here. Trees with pastures can be great natural resources, providing greater goods and conservation services in livestock production systems. So, thank you, and I'll stop there.
Is there a quick question right now for John?